Hi everyone. In this fourth lecture of week 3, we are going to move from the primeval history in Genesis 1 through 11 to stories in a section of the literature called the Patriarchal Narratives. And the Patriarchal Narratives will run from Genesis 12 through 50, and they are called the Patriarchal Narratives because, of course, they have to do with the patriarchs and to a large degree the matriarchs of Israel. Okay. As before, you can listen to this video just as an audio if you wish. And again, it would be best if you have read the biblical materials before, and possibly Coogan, before you listen to this lecture, okay? When one turns from the primeval history to the patriarchal narratives, there's really a shift in narrative focus. And some would argue that there's a kind of shift in the kind of deity that is represented in these stories as well. In the primeval history, especially with the lovely framing device by P, by putting in the first story, okay, the P first story in Genesis 1:1, and following, God is really envisioned as God of the entire world, okay, who becomes, if you follow the trajectory of the primeval narratives from 1 to 11, who becomes increasingly distant as things with humanity keep turning out badly. Okay. In the patriarchal narrative, you almost get the sense that, maybe if you're reading the Bible as a whole, because things have turned out so badly with God dealing with the entirety of humanity, that God has now decided to focus on one family. Okay, so in the patriarchal narratives, really what you get is this particular deity now imagined as what scholars call the God of the fathers. Okay, this is a patriarchal God who is really the deity of a particular clan or a particular family. And this is a God that is interested in taking care of that family, keeping them safe, making sure they succeed. Okay. Genesis 12, which is where the patriarchal narratives begin, again, starts very suddenly with God's call to the founding member of this family, whose name is Abram. His name will be later changed to Abraham. As a result, I will probably use the names interchangeably. And Abram will come to be the founder of a family or group known as Israel. And Abraham is extremely important. Abraham is really, it's minimizing him to say that he's the founder of just Israel, because of course he is really associated with 3 different monotheistic faith traditions, okay, really seen as the founder of Judaism, which of course emerges from these stories about Abraham and as a patriarch of Israel, but of course also Christianity, which is a subset or an offshoot of Judaism, and of course also later Islam, okay, through Abraham's other son Ishmael. Abraham's story begins this way in Genesis 12. So this is 12:1 and following. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse, and then you, or through you," it's a little hard here, "all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed. Abraham took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions that they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran. They mean slaves here. Okay. And they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. Notice that Abraham's story, and therefore that of Sarai, his wife, and of course his family, and of course all the kind of unnamed servants and slaves that are under his protection or part of his sort of household. And notice how abruptly it begins with almost no introduction. And you do wonder if there were other stories that maybe did introduce them that were maybe dropped out of the biblical text, or maybe that these stories that Abraham was so well known that, when the editor went to kind of collect these stories, they just kind of pulled them and kind of put it into an order. We'll maybe talk about the ordering of the Abrahamic narratives later in another video. Okay. Abraham is said to, is commanded to leave everything and everyone that he knows behind, okay? His country, his kindred, his father's house, and some people have seen a kind of importance to the repetition. The biblical language, biblical Hebrew is very succinct. So anytime it focuses or repeats, you have to wonder what the narrator's purpose is, okay? As we know, Abraham after moving and Sarai after moving will never see their homeland or birthplace again. And of course, moving back then in the ancient times was not the same as moving now. Okay, so with no police force or medical emergency, your family really was your only protection. So this was a big, huge risk. And notice that Abram is rather elderly. He's 75 when he sets out. And his wife is also rather elderly. We are told in some other part of the text that she is 10 years younger. Okay. And if this move was risky for Abram, it was, of course, a greater risk for Sarai, his wife. Okay. If this moving party would have been attacked, and of course, it's not clear, whether you will be safe. Not only could she have been killed, but she could have been raped, taken as a slave. Indeed, immediately after the move, the vulnerability of Sarah is evident when Abraham's group is forced to go to Egypt, and she is quickly taken into the harem. And I'll talk about that later in this video. Okay. Sarah's vulnerability is increased by the fact that, as the narrative keeps telling you, she is infertile, and therefore she doesn't have any son. Okay, and what this means practically was that there was no legitimate heir to Abraham, and also for Sarah. Okay, for Sarah, this meant that if Abram, her elderly husband, were to have suddenly died on this trip, she probably likely would have been unable to inherit. Okay, indeed, there's one story of women inheriting in the Hebrew Bible, but it seems like it was almost a kind of special condition. Okay. So she would have been unable to inherit and would have almost immediately become destitute, away from her homeland, from her own family. She would have been also unable to return to her father's house in order to seek protection from either her brothers or other male members of her family. With Abraham's death, therefore, Sarah might have very quickly gone from a matriarch to a servant or a slave or either kind of a homeless vagabond in a foreign land. Okay. Indeed, sons were the main protection that women, both economically and socially, had. And therefore, infertility was a big deal in the ancient world. And as now still to some degree, it was largely also blamed on women. Okay, so considering all that, it is no wonder that most of the patriarchal narratives in the biblical text, especially the Abraham stories, will be constantly focused on whether the right son, this right promised son, will be born to the right infertile woman. Okay. Now, there's another reason why the Abrahamic stories, or the patriarchal narratives in particular, are so focused on this kind of, the birth of the right son. And it has to do with something called the Abrahamic promise. Notice how in the very beginning of the chapter, though it's a little bit more subtle in Genesis 12, and becomes a little bit less subtle as we move into the text, notice that God promises Abram some things for taking this arduous and dangerous journey. And what God promises him, again, like I said, becomes a little bit clearer. But, God says that Abram, for doing this, will become a great nation. Okay, and implied in that is, of course, that Abraham, who currently is childless, will have lots of descendants. Okay. Later, God will promise Abram and his descendants a particular special piece of land, okay, as well as a kind of special relationship between God and Abram's descendants. Okay. And this promise of God, of land, progeny, and the special relationship to Abraham and his descendants is called the Abrahamic promise. Okay. And much of the stories of Abraham and Sarah will focus on, the reason why they're so focused on sons, right, is because underneath it is this other question of which son will inherit the Abrahamic promise and therefore become elect or chosen. Okay. This question of who is a true heir to the Abrahamic promise, right, or this problem of it, one can say, explains the strange story that is found at the end of Genesis 12. So Genesis, and this is found in Genesis 12:10 through 20. Okay, and this story talks about Abraham and Sarah who end up in Egypt, and it doesn't present the nicest picture of the patriarch. Okay, we are told in Genesis 12 that at first Sarai and Abraham's migration or journey goes very smoothly. They head towards the land of Canaan, which is this promised land. Okay, Canaan, the promised land, is the same area. And they pass by some famous locations. One wonder if some scholars have said that the marking, that the naming of territories or even of trees or markers is a way to claim that land. Okay. So they pass some famous locations before running into trouble when the land is struck by famine. And as a result of this famine, they are forced to turn away from the promised land towards Egypt. Okay, the breadbasket of the ancient Near East, in order to ride out the famine. Okay, and then the biblical text, when you go towards the promised land, it is envisioned as going towards the promise, divine promise. When you go away from the promised land, you are seen as getting farther away from God's promise. Okay. So they go to Egypt. Egypt was, of course, a breadbasket of the world, so it makes sense that they would go there during famine. Indeed, it was such a fertile area, such a fecund area, that the biblical writers stereotyped the Egyptians as overly interested in sex. Okay, and then you'll see the stereotype reemerge over and over again. Indeed, in other ancient texts, you do. This stereotype seems to have sort of been widespread. In other texts, you hear about how in Egypt there's a greater propensity for women to have twins. Okay. So, and it might be the strange stereotype of Egyptians as more overtly sexual or something, or more fertile, it's not clear, that might undergird Abraham's strange plan for Sarah to lie about her status as his wife when they reach Egypt. And this is found in Genesis 12:11. When he, that is Abram, was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know well that you're a beautiful woman in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister so that it may go well with me because of you and that my life may be spared on your account." Okay. So because Sarah is beautiful, Abram is afraid that as her husband, he will, of course, be killed so that she can be taken into the harem. Okay. Now, if you follow the trajectory of the narrative, Sarah is 65 here. Okay. So the fact that she's deemed attractive, right, so as to jeopardize her husband's safety, again, there's really maybe perhaps different notions of beauty, okay, or aging, right? Or some scholars, I mean, again, this is not the PC argument. Some scholars argue that perhaps these stories in the biblical text about these matriarchs and patriarchs are not really, they're not meant to be read linearly. They're kind of in some kind of linear order, but not precise. Okay. Abram, to save his own skin, therefore asks his wife to lie and say that she is his sister, which she does, and of course, therefore, is quickly taken into Pharaoh's harem. Okay, and Abram, as Sarai's supposed brother, is not killed, but instead, things go extremely well for him, at least kind of monetarily. We're told in Genesis 12:16, and for her sake, he, that is Pharaoh, dealt well with Abram, and he has sheep and oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. In this situation where Abraham grows increasingly rich, okay, while his wife is in Pharaoh's harem, this continues until God afflicts Pharaoh's house with plagues as punishment for taking Sarai into a harem. Okay, and notice how God punishes Pharaoh and not Abraham. Again, this is not a God that likes everyone equally. This is a God of the fathers. He likes some families more than others and some guys more than others, okay? When Pharaoh becomes aware of Sarai's real status, he of course confronts Abraham, asking him, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Okay, and then lets them all go, okay, to continue their journey. Needless to say, the story about Abraham and Sarah takes a decidedly disturbing turn when they arrive in Egypt. And the portrayal of Abraham is especially distressing as the patriarch is shown as not only lying about Sarai's identity, but also kind of selling or prostituting his wife, okay, exchanging access to her for material gain. Okay, and as I stated, he seems to have grown rather rich by this scheme. Okay, indeed, it's not clear to me that Abraham was in any hurry to end this kind of lucrative scheme until God barges in and punishes Pharaoh. Notice how he doesn't punish Abraham for this and puts a stop to it. Okay, and these actions again undercut or maybe complexify the portrayal of Abraham at the beginning of the narrative as this kind of paragon of faithfulness and piety. Okay, if Abram is so faithful as to blindly follow the directives of an unknown deity to immigrate to another land, well, why doesn't Abram return to that same deity to ask for help instead of concocting this very strange plan about his wife? Okay, so Abraham is pictured in a very mixed way. Okay, also distressing in a slightly different way is the silence of Sarah. We are never told, her feelings are never inquired about, as if they don't matter. Her well-being doesn't seem to be much of a concern to either the narrator or to her husband. Now at this point you might say, well, God seems to care for her, Sarah, that's why he puts a stop to the whole thing. Well, I mean, maybe. More likely the case, God intrudes, God probably intrudes not because he really cares about Sarah, but because of her status as Abram's wife. Okay, and indeed, the biblical text supports this reading. If you read it very carefully, by constantly emphasizing Sarai's status as Abraham's wife, or literally his woman. Anytime you read wife, it says in Hebrew woman, okay, right after stating that God afflicted Pharaoh and his household in Genesis 12:17. Okay, as a parent, it is her status as Abram's wife, and therefore as a property of the chosen male patriarch. That is probably what leads God to intrude on God's behalf, on Abram's behalf and on Sarah's behalf, not necessarily her stress or her suffering. Okay. Now, indeed, that God's worry is centered on Sarah's position as Abram's wife is evident when you look at the Abrahamic story as a whole. Okay, remember that what is centrally important to the biblical author in the patriarchal narratives is which son will become the bearer of the Abrahamic promise, a promise that God makes in the story right before this incident in Egypt. If the question is which son will inherit this kind of special relationship, okay, think about how problematic it would be if Sarah, okay, Abraham's wife, this guy that God just made a promise to, becomes pregnant with Pharaoh's child, which is a real possibility in the harem. Okay. One way to explain the story, therefore, is that the purpose of the story is to dispel that possibility. Okay, to say, well, no, Sarah's son is the true heir to the Abrahamic promise, and we all know who Sarah's son is. This is, Isaac, who will become, of course, the founder of the Israelite nation. Okay, so the narrative seems to be centered on kind of dispelling the possibility of questions about illegitimacy of Isaac. Okay, how do we know that Isaac, or Sarah's son, is the true son of Abraham and not of Pharaoh? Well, God got the whole family out of there before things went terribly awry. Okay. Just a side note, you will find, if you read the biblical text in the patriarchal narratives, this story seems to have become, for some reason, very important. There are actually 3 variants of the story about the ancestors of Israel getting stuck, okay, in a foreign land and God having to rescue them. Twice with Abraham and Sarah, and once with Isaac and Rebecca, his wife. Okay? So there seems to have been maybe variations. Perhaps this was oral originally. Okay, it's not clear. Okay. There may be another way to explain Genesis 12, or the purpose of Genesis 12, and this very strange story about the Israelite ancestors getting stuck in Egypt. Okay, so think about the story. Okay, There's a famine. The ancestors of the Israelites, they go to Egypt. They get stuck in Egypt until God sends a plague, at which point the Israelites are allowed to go back to their land. Okay. Notice how similar this story sounds to another famous story that's coming up. Okay, namely the story in Exodus. Okay, the great exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Okay. Really, the Abram and Sarah story is a miniature exodus. Okay, so why do we have miniature exodus here? Okay, and the first reason is because of the ancestors of Israel are not really, they're kind of two things. Okay, they are both characters, single characters. Okay, but as ancestors, they are also, they also represent the entire nation of Israel in general. And a fancy word for this is that they are eponymous. And so each character will become both a symbol of Israel and also of themselves, of the individual character. Okay. There may be another reason why the writers portray these ancestors of Israel kind of pre-living the Exodus in miniature. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about this probably when I get to Exodus, but it's because the Exodus really, if you think about it, was a theologically problematic event. Okay, and one of the big problems of the Exodus is why God waits so darn long, 400 years. Notice the repetition of the number 40 as the number of testing. Why God waits 400 years to get his beloved, special nation out of there. Okay. And this story perhaps may be an attempt to kind of address that question. Okay, and it does so by saying, well, maybe, God has a larger master plan. Okay, so, why does Abram and Sarah relive the Exodus beforehand? Well, in order to show the readers or the listeners, okay, that when you come to the story of Exodus, to show them that this is all part of God's master plan, that God has things under control, that God will, of course, get his special group out of there before any real damage can be done, just as he did with Abraham and Sarah. Okay. Okay, well, turn to the next video for the continuing saga of Abraham and Sarai.